to this taster session for Birkbeck for the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology. This first session is entitled Whose Past Is It Anyway? Stakeholders, Scholarship and Museum Spaces. And although, as I said, I'm Kat Hill, I'm a historian of early modern history, so kind of 16th to 18th century history. This is quite representative of some of the things that we think about in courses that we teach across your years of study with the department at Birkbeck. So for example, next year I'm teaching a course for the final year students called Stories in Stuff, where we look at 20 objects across different museums and different collections, and we trace their histories and their stories. And we're asking questions like, what are their biographies? What are the life stories of these objects? How have they come into collections? How can historians, archaeologists, classicists, scholars of the past use them? And what are some of the debates about those objects? So we're going to kind of look at this question with something quite specific, and one particular object in a very well-known institution. Hopefully this institution might be recognisable to some of you. Does anyone want to tell me which museum this is? They can either chat or put it in the chat or put up your hand. Does anyone know where this is? Somewhere very close to Birkbeck if you're coming to study. Yeah, good, it's the British Museum, Sophie and Meg. So the British Museum, which is right near Birkbeck when we're allowed back in offices and back in institutions. And of course, a very famous heritage institution within the UK. And I'm sure many of you will have been and visited, you might have looked at the objects and studied various periods of history related to objects in this museum. The history of the museum itself is what we're going to be thinking about a little bit today in relation to a particular object, about how something came into the museum. The museum opened in 1759 and it was based off the collection of a man called Sir Hans Sloane, who was a physician and a president of the Royal Society, and he had a huge collection of about 80,000 kind of what he called rarities, natural rarities. He had books and manuscripts and also coins and medals. And in 1753, an Act of Parliament made this a collection which was going to be the first public museum. Sloane had developed his own collection through global networks created by imperial expansion. Many of the kind of endeavours were also financed from money which came from enslaved labour on Jamaican sugar plantations. So there's the long history of how this is entangled with dark histories of kind of slavery and imperial expansion. And then this collection of Sloane becomes open to the public. After the 18th century, it grows. More objects are acquired, either through colonial endeavours. Some are purchased, others have been bequeathed by wealthy donors. Excavations, sales, and other bequests by collectors. So the collection grows into what we see today in the British Museum. Has anyone seen anything particular at the British Museum that they remember, or anyone visited, and anyone seen anything there that they remember being interesting or they can recall? Rosetta Stone, yep, very famous, exactly, Nina. The Rosetta Stone, which is kind of one of those iconic pieces of the British Museum, crucial in deciphering classical languages, and is kind of a real centerpiece of its collections. And so it's a really good example, actually, Nina, because it's kind of one of those headline objects. So, you know, it's one of the things that's kind of made into lots of the things in the gift shop. This is another very iconic object. This is the one we're going to be looking at. So ancient Greek and Mayan objects, Meg, yeah, really interesting, especially if you're thinking of doing ancient history or archaeology. Those will be really interesting things to look at. This is the one we're going to focus on today. Has anyone seen this? Does anyone know what this particular object is? Yeah, good. So we've got some good answers here from Meg and Nina. This is an Easter Island statue or an Easter Island head. So this is one of two statues or moai from Rapa Nui or Easter Island, which are held by the British Museum. This one, which is the one on display, which is in a gallery dedicated to different ideas about life and death in the British Museum. And then the other one is actually in storage, and you can't see it. And these moai are huge statues placed upon ceremonial platforms on Rapa Nui, and they're said to be the Aringa Ora, the living faces of ancestors. And the name of this statue, Hoa Hakanananyai, means lost, hidden, or stolen friend, and it's one of about 10 moai which was carved from basalt and dates to Easter Island from about 1000 to 1200. So what we want to think about, and what I want you to just kind of touch on today in this taster, is to think about why is it in London? There's something which comes from Easter Island, and what are the debates about whether it should stay here and what its place is in the British Museum? Well, the name gives you some clues: the lost, hidden, or stolen friend. So this is where Easter Island is, or Rapa Nui. So in the southern Pacific Ocean. It's now part of Chile. It was annexed by Chile in 1888. And so these two statues, the moai, one which is on display and one which is in storage in the British Museum, come from this small island from Rapa Nui. And these human figures carved by people on Rapa Nui are particularly important. They kind of represent, as I said, either deities or forms of their ancestors, living ancestors. These ideas that they're living faces, and they be placed to kind of in these arrangements to gaze inland across the people after death. The ones that you see up on the top left here are ones which have been restored on Rapa Nui by Chilean archaeologists. So these have been not kind of as they would have looked originally, but restored idea of the statues as they would have looked on Rapa Nui. So how does this statue get all the way from the British Museum to from Chile, this Chilean island, Rapa Nui in the Pacific Ocean, to the British Museum? Well, in 1868, so the height of British imperial power, the crew of a British survey ship arrive on Rapa Nui. This is the HMS Topaz. The crew led to the location of one of these statues, the one that's now in storage, which is called Moai Hava, and they collect it. They take it with them. And then soon after, they discover the second in a house in a village called Orongo, and two crew members searching the village find this statue. The commander, Commodore Richard Powell, decides to dig out the statue, which had been buried up to its shoulders, which was a kind of how they were often laid out, how this statue was kept. And the intent is to bring both of these statues to England. So they take both of these on a sledge to the shore and take it back on to their ship and take it back to England. And then in 1869, are offered to Queen Victoria by the Admiralty. And then Queen Victoria subsequently donates these statues to the British Museum. So in 1869, they arrive and are taken over by the trustees of the British Museum. And as I say, now they sit in this gallery, a kind of really iconic element of this gallery. It's called the Welcome Gallery and dedicated to different understandings of life and death. So this is a statue which represents the idea of ancestors in a very different culture from our own. But it's a very controversial object and has been the subject of much debate in the last 2 or 3 years. So, So this woman here, this is Tarita Alassane Rapu, a governor of Rapa Nui, who was part of an effort to get the statues returned to Easter Island, to Rapa Nui. They made a formal written request for the return of these statues in July 2018. And following this, a delegation visited the British Museum, as well as representatives from the Chilean government, from the Commission for Antiquities. And this woman, the governor, asked the British Museum to give the people of Rapa Nui a chance to get these statues back. She said, "My grandma, who passed away at almost 90 years, she never got the chance to see her ancestor. I am almost half a century alive, and this is my first time. I believe that my children and their children also deserve the opportunity to touch, see, and learn from him. We are just a body. You, the British people, have our soul." So the idea that this is, this is not just a piece of basalt. This is not just a piece of stone. It's a really, really important part of the heritage and the culture of the people of Rapa Nui. It was at one point likened to having the the body of an ancestor, of your grandfather in a museum somewhere else. This is really important to the people of Rapa Nui. There have been ongoing discussions between the British Museum and representatives of Rapa Nui, and also the Chilean government. Staff from the British Museum went out to Rapa Nui to look at the local culture and the significance of the statue. And there've been more visits from those involved in restoration and museum efforts from Rapa Nui to the British Museum. But as it stands, the British Museum's official position is that they recognise that this is a very important artefact, that they want to develop much stronger relations with the people of Rapa Nui to fully understand and to make accessible to people this part of their culture, but that it also remains a really important item in their collections, and that they believe that by having it in the museum, they're making this narrative of Rapa Nui culture accessible to a much wider public and for wider study, and to raise awareness of culture on Rapa Nui. And therefore that the statue will remain in the British Museum. So there's this idea of deaccession policy of giving things back. This is not something which the British Museum says they will entertain, although they will continue to carry on these discussions. And then there have been other famous cases of discussions over whether things should be returned, repatriated, the Elgin marbles being a very famous one, and Benin bronzes as well. That's a very good point, Aisha, and that's what I want. That doesn't it seem contradictory to refuse them the statues, want to make their culture more known? That's a really good question, and I'm going to ask you guys now to think about what you think about this issue. And I think that there are not easy answers to these questions, and this is exactly what the types of things that you guys will be debating in seminars. This is the kind of thing that you will be touching on. So what I'm going to do is, what I want you to think about is, in this particular case, there are various stakeholders. There are various people who have got an interest in what happens to Rapa Nui, what happens to the statue. So who should get a say, and what should that say be? So I'm going to ask you a series of poll questions, and I'm going to ask you to vote a simple yes or no, which is a little bit artificial, but hopefully it will get you just to get to think and to ask to give your answer, and then I'm going to ask you why you gave that answer. So who has a say in what happens to the Moai statues? And so the first group I want you to think about is, do the people of Rapa Nui have a say? So if you can poll your answers, simple yes or no. I appreciate that's a rather Sophie has raised a really interesting point. I think it's hard. I don't think it was right of us to take parts of other people's cultures when we have so much available. if they are going to take care of the statue, why shouldn't they have it? That's a really important point, Sophie, and some of the debates have centred around what happens to the statue when it goes back. Should it be something which is preserved, and what are the conditions? Who is going to take it back? Will it be the Chilean government, or will it be the people of Rapa Nui? So most people have voted, so I'll stop the poll there. So everyone here voted, everyone who's voted yes, they think the people of Rapa Nui have a say to what happens to the Moai statue. Why do we think that's important? Does someone want to volunteer their answer? You can either put up your hand and you can speak if you feel comfortable speaking, or you can type in the chat. Some people have already given their views. Aisha says we care only for its historical aspects, but it's culturally and spiritually significant to the people of Rapa Nui. Anyone else want to say why they said yes? Good. Nina said I think that's a really important part of what you said there, is the vital to their culture, that it should be given back with conditions to take care of it. And that's, to say, much like Sophie's point, it's been the questions around if it is going to be preserved and where it should be. So the fact that it's part of their culture, the fact that it's part of that it belongs to them, belongs to their past, and that it holds value for them. So we get a sense that people of Rapa Nui should have a really important role within this. Fletch saying that it's an important part of their culture and people would like to see it. And so similar views here. So you can, this is one of the most important arguments about how many objects of course have come into collections. And if we extended that argument to lots of objects, then many things might be given back, and that might be, we would argue, the right thing to do. But you can see the implications if you were speaking from the point of the board of the British Museum Trustees of the process of repatriation. But all the points you make are really, really important ones, and exactly why people have said the people of Rapa Nui should have a say. The next people I'm going to ask you if they have a say in it, in what happens, is Chilean government. So this is not the East Islander people, this is not the people of Rapa Nui, this is the Chilean government, the people who are responsible for kind of negotiating things like UNESCO status, for deciding what's an antiquity, for setting up heritage museums and working with local people. Do the Chilean government have a say in what happens to Rapa Nui? So more split here. We've got some no's and some yeses. More yeses so far. Oh no, it's evened up. Okay. Interesting. Good. Okay, so Meg, you said only to an extent. Why only to an extent? What do you think that extent might be? Does anyone else want to say? People, especially people who said no, why did people think no, they didn't have, like, perhaps the right to say what happens to it? And then we'll think about some of the yeses. Why did the Chilean government not necessarily get to say what happens to the Moai? Anyone want to volunteer their answer? Great, Sophie, I think they have a say because most likely without their support, the statue wouldn't get the care and preservation. They should have a say in order to help the statue last for longer, not for anything else. Yeah, really interesting, Sophie, exactly. That this is a bigger question about what we are how we think of these objects, and what the role is. Are we preserving them for future generations? Are we returning to a community because it's part of their kind of cultural heritage? For protecting it, ensuring that it remains accessible, that point about making it more known to people and people understanding culture of Rapa Nui. Mel, I think that's a really good point. I don't know enough about the Chilean relationship, and I think that's crucial, because one argument we could say, a potential no, is that this is now kind of it's a famous case. You can see that this is going to make money. They might want to put the statue in a museum in Chile rather than back on Rapa Nui, and that this would be kind of exploitation. I'm not saying necessarily that is what is happening, but you could make that argument, and that they're just kind of using it for themselves. Exactly, Tom, that they are, in a sense, they're holding it instead of the islanders. But at the same time, that those arguments about if we want to preserve things for future generations, how we go about doing that. And I think those are some of the debates that you've touched on, which are really, really important. And yeah, again, some really, really good arguments from David and from Fletch about the relationship, again, about Chile recently annexing the island, and also the kind of the role of the government. And I think, one thing that, we're talking in quite idealistic terms, which is great, about what should belong to people and how you return things. But of course, we're talking about power here as well. We're talking about things which cost money, which require negotiations between different governments, and those all come into play. So Roshan saying that they perhaps should be a middleman, a point of contact. So that could be one way of thinking it. Okay, so we've got Rapa Nui, we've got the Chilean government. The next person I'm going to ask, sorry, I've just lost the chat, is Anaisha. Yes, you're right, there could be a boost in tourism, and we shouldn't deny that heritage is part of tourism, because if you want money to preserve things for the past, that does involve money, and so there is an element of the market here as well, which is going on. Okay, so Chilean government, Rapa Nui. What about the Board of Trustees of the British Museum? Yeah, that's a good point, Fletch, about the relationship of trust, exactly, between the people of Rapa Nui and the government. And I think that's a really important question in all these negotiations, that it's not, if we want to repatriate or send things back, it's not as simple as sometimes. And even if it were sent back to the Rapa Nui Islanders, oh, sorry, did I just stop the poll? I didn't mean to. Sorry, it's not sure why it's done that. There we go. Sorry, reset it for some reason. Okay, Board of Trustees of the British Museum. Do they get a say in what happens to the Moai statue? Again, fairly even split. More saying yes, some saying no. Good, those of you who've already voted, people can carry on voting. Those of you who said yes, why do you think the Board of the Trustees of the British Museum gets a say? And what type of say do they have in this discussion, do you think? And obviously it's going to be a very important question for them. That's something that they, if anything is going to be repatriated or sent back, it's going to be a decision that the board makes. But what right or what way in which do we think they should have a role in this discussion? Should they get say? Good. Okay, so Aisha, that it's not just about money. There are things about how it's preserved and the logistics. If you think about how the board is made up, it isn't just people who are interested in kind of the market of the British Museum, but that it is about preserving things. Yes, so there's that that we could think about. But Sophie, on the other side completely, that it's a loss to lose something which is such a kind of iconic part of your collection. And if you start returning one object, what are the rules, what are the conditions under which repatriating an object happens? Does it have to be something which has been taken in violence, as part of an imperial expansion, what are the kind of rules that you set around it? And these will be things that will coming into the British Museum's head, certainly. Rachel, yes, constant communication to help it remain accessible to, because what part of what the British Museum wants to do, even if you can disagree with some of what it's doing, is to educate people on other cultures. And one argument from them would be they're less able to do this if they don't have it. Yep, Fletcher, they'll say that they'll take care of it. It doesn't belong to them, but it will bring more people to them. And Tom, exactly, that's a consideration, is that if what we're interested in is preservation, there's a worry if repatriating things might lead to their destruction, or them, they may be preserved, they may be destroyed. So there's all these types of considerations, which are partly about visitors, they're partly about money, they're about education, but they're also about knowledge and what ideas people have about preservation. And Aisha, that's a really good point, that you just take to say that we're just taking them and using to educate, and that's perhaps an arrogant way to see it as well, and that we are therefore using something which is really important to people, but that's still for kind of also our own benefit, and we're taking that. And I think that's a really important point, and it touches on a really key debate about how we do go about a process of engaging with other cultures, with other objects, and with the rights of those communities as well. And Stephen, yeah, there's completely the argument about this has been with the British Museum, it's been kept intact, and they have a say in what happens to it, and at what point things become something people should return, and under what conditions. So these are very complex debates. The last person I'm going to ask you to think about is academics and scholars working on Rapa Nui. Do they get a say in what happens to Moai? Okay, interesting. Also quite split. We've got some yeses and nos. Again, anyone who's voted, carry on voting. Anyone who either yes or no, tell me a little bit about why you voted what you voted. Why should academics and scholars get a say or not in what happens to this object? More yeses than nos. Okay, so good, Meg, the valuable insight, good expertise about where it might be better and preserving it and negotiating. And yes, thinking about its cultural significance and preservation. And David, I think your argument about it reaching more people is a fundamental one. And your point about costs about traveling to Rapa Nui is really, really important, because it's balancing the needs between trying to, if you want to preserve cultures, or you want to protect things that that may otherwise may be destroyed, or you want to educate people about different places, then you've got to give people some context or contact with their culture, and you can't necessarily, everyone can't visit Rapa Nui. And so there's this role of scholarship and education. And Nina, yeah, and exactly right, that you could say then that the people of Rapa Nui are the ones who have a right to education with their own culture, with their own artifacts. One possible solution which has been suggested is that the original goes back to Rapa Nui and a replica would be put in its place with a full contextual description and understanding of what the statue is, and how it would be preserved in when it's taken back to Papanui. And that is one suggestion. It's one solution that has been used for other contentious objects in other heritage contexts as well. And Tom, I really like your point about there being little archaeological significance of taking an object out of context, and that's a really important point about where we see things and how we see objects in context. And the debates about what role academics have and accessibility of sites. But I think there's this issue, Aisha said, you touched on at the end, of financial gain. So really interesting discussions from you all. So thank you so much for engaging so intelligently, in so much detail, with some of these questions that I've raised with you. Very quickly, because I'm conscious that your next session is up with Tim, I want to leave you with a couple of examples of how other museum contexts have dealt with similar issues and why it matters to historians, because these are all debates about what things we tell our past with, who gets a right to tell the story of the past, how that past is communicated to a wider public, and how we talk about different narratives of the past with different cultures and different communities. So you might think of, obviously, if you're doing history, you're doing documents. Those of you who are doing classics, archaeology, ancient history, you're going to be interacting with objects, material cultures as well. But what are the contexts in which we encounter those? So just to finish off, this is an object which I saw in the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. It's a drum which is used by Indigenous First Nations communities in the area. They had a similar debate about whether objects should be returned to these communities or kept within the museum, and they have a very close working relationship with the First Nations communities there. And this is an object, a drum would be used in ceremonial purposes. It would be beaten, and so it has meaning through its kind of ritual significance. So this was a newly made object, which was then hit deliberately with painted sticks, so that when it's displayed in the museum, it shows the memory of the sound of the music as used by the indigenous communities there. So that's a kind of an example of how a museum has worked very closely with an artist and with the community to try and display something in a way where it has meaning, both to those who might visit who are not part of these communities, but also the way in which that community are happy with it. Okay, guys, thank you very much. I'm going to leave you there, because I'm going to pass on to Tim. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to meeting you guys, hopefully in person, in October, and that you enjoy the rest of the session.